Okay.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the session. We're happy to make some time at your. Try to have you all with us today. We have participants who are in the room and participants who are online. So we have three speakers for this panel, and I'm grateful to all of them for giving their time for this event. I will introduce them very, very briefly, and then they are going to speak on whatever aspects of this they like, and then we can have some time for a general discussion and Q&A. So our first speaker is Dr. Khaled Al-Gindi at the Middle East Institute. We also have Dr. Dana Lloyd and Dr. Jonathan O'Neill, both from the Department of Global Interdisciplinary Studies here at Villanova. And I'm Catherine Warwick from the Political Science Department and the editor of the Digest of Middle East Studies. And my role in this panel is primarily to moderate. So thank you all again for joining us, and I will turn it over to Dr. Al-Gindi.
Thank you, Catherine. It's a pleasure to be with you all virtually. So, just a point of clarification: I'm not doctor, but thank you for the honorary title. I do also, in addition to my day job at Middle East Institute, I also am an adjunct professor at Georgetown, and so I'm approaching this from that perspective as well. So, as it turns out. At the moment of October 7th, I happened to be teaching a seminar on Palestinian politics last fall, and two of my students had family in Gaza, and so the events were very real and the trauma, I think, was very palpable for them, certainly, but also for all of us in the class, because we were, like everyone else, kind of watching everything unfold in real time, but with maybe a bit more of a direct connection. So that said, I mean, I'll just offer up some general observations with regard to the topic of how this war, and I think it's much more than a war, but for the purpose of, for purposes of convenience, we'll stick to that kind of shorthand nomenclature. But I do think that the phenomenon that we're going to discuss, or the dynamics that we're going to discuss, are happening all across the education sector, across the board, not just in universities, but I think as much in middle and high schools, some cases maybe even elementary schools, all across the country, and every jurisdiction that you can imagine. These debates are happening. I know they're happening in my kids' high school, as well as in neighboring counties and jurisdictions in the DC metro area. More to the point, I think what we're seeing now, in particular in relation to the Gaza war, is a dynamic that we've seen in place in Israel-Palestine, in the Israel-Palestine debate in the US for a long time. And that is a highly one-sided discussion and policing of that debate. But it's happened in a much more stark and overtly, I would say, authoritarian ways. We saw that from the very get-go. The moment that the October 7th attack happened, there was an enormous gap in expressions of sympathy, solidarity, and even humanity. I think I know my university, Georgetown, like probably most, issued a statement of some sort. Some statements were more balanced than others, but by and large, they were not. They were quite one-sided, to the point that I think it really struck people the kind of invisibility of Palestinians in that very same moment. Notwithstanding obviously the atrocities committed on October 7th, there were also atrocities being committed in Gaza at that very same moment. And we saw in very stark terms, not just an asymmetry in power, but a kind of asymmetry in humanity, or in the value of human life. At least that's how a lot of people like me interpreted it. You know, there was outpouring of sympathy and solidarity for Jewish and Israeli lives, and virtually nothing for the hundreds of Palestinians who were also being killed, displaced, and you know, otherwise brutalized in that same moment. There was some, in some cases, a kind of corrective, but by and large, I think that imbalance has held true. Since then, I think we've seen that asymmetry reflected in the power dynamics as well. We've seen banning of student groups on particularly one side of the issue, Students for Justice in Palestine in particular, and Jewish Voices for Peace. Those two groups have been especially targeted. There have been blanket bans in states like Florida, selective bans in particular universities like Columbia University and others, doxing, harassment, blacklisting, even physical attacks on students were all very real threats that were happening, and they were happening, I think, by and large. I'm not at all saying that there weren't any pro-Palestine activists involved in you know, bad faith or negative or even racist activity or attacks. But I think by and large, the targets have been students who were expressing views in relation to Palestinian rights and sort of pro-Palestinian voices. We've also seen a rash of you know, speakers being uninvited, events being canceled, in some cases, even cultural expressions were being censored. I know at my alma mater, to my shame and embarrassment, Indiana University, there was an art exhibit by a Palestinian American artist that was canceled simply because of the political views expressed by the particular artist, who, as I said, is Palestinian American, and because she criticized the war in Gaza. Now imagine a world in which every artist who spoke out against a war was censored, or uninvited or canceled. We'd hardly have any art exhibits at all. And so it's quite targeted and selective, I think. I think perhaps most disturbing has been watching university presidents being summoned by Congress and grilled by Congress members on anti-Semitism, or what they interpreted as anti-Semitism. In some cases, they were dismissed from their posts, all of which I think had the look and feel of a kind of new McCarthyism. I think the fact that very powerful political forces are mobilizing enormous resources in favor of these repressive measures and policies and laws in some cases is genuinely truly frightening. When a powerful group like the Anti-Defamation League openly accuses SJPs and calls on the Department of Justice to investigate student groups for material support for terrorism. I mean, this is really terrifying stuff. I mean, these are students after all. And I think that is partly the goal, right? The goal is to instill fear and in these students, to drive them away from their activism. But it's real. And these are not, you know, fringe groups. The ADL obviously is not a fringe institution. So there's no doubt at all that it is having, I think, a chilling effect on the debate. On the other hand, I think in a lot of ways, the movement is actually bigger than the repression. I think the reason that we see such powerful forces mobilizing, in my opinion, is because they're losing the narrative, or at least they believe that they're losing the narrative. enough that they would resort to what I think are kind of desperate measures. What I'm hearing from folks all across the country is that there's a huge divide between the students on the one hand and university administrations on the other. You know, if you've lost the battle for hearts and minds, you sort of resort to legislating or litigating what is or isn't acceptable speech. I mean, this is kind of the last refuge. You know, once you've lost the narrative, then you have to resort to these kind of authoritarian measures. I would note, though, that students don't seem to be, by and large, again, obviously a lot of people have been frightened out of their activism, but from what I can tell, students don't seem to be deterred. I mean, the protests are continuing, but also much more risky activity. You know, these are students who are obviously have their futures, their careers to think about. They have student loans. They've got, there's quite a lot of risk and liability for them. And so when we see divestment resolutions continuing to pass, even now, at UVA, at UC Riverside, and I think perhaps most significantly, Harvard Law School, just last week, Harvard has been really kind of the epicenter of this whole controversy in so many ways. The doxing that happened at Harvard, of course, the Harvard University leadership that had been summoned before Congress, open threats by, you know, law firms and bajillionaires saying we'll never hire another Harvard grad ever again. And so for the Harvard Law School students to do that, I think is quite huge. And I think it's a sign that maybe we are in a very different moment than we had been on this issue. And the way people talk about Israel and Palestine is changing, and I think the epicenter of that change is in the academic arena, particularly university campuses.
All right, thank you. That is such a nice summary of a lot of things that we've been seeing, the sort of bits and pieces and the various aspects. And having it pulled all together like that, I think is very helpful. And it's nice to have this space where we can all lay that out, identify it, and talk about it. So I will ask Dana actually to speak next, if that's okay, Dana?
Absolutely.
From here?
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Khaled. This was great. And I think all the things that I want to talk about or to open up here are following up on the things that you said. I'll start by saying that when Catherine invited us, she mentioned that one thing that she would like us to talk about is exactly this sense of fear among especially junior faculty members to express solidarity with Palestine. And my initial reaction was that this narrative about being threatened is actually the work that it's doing is to frighten us, right? Like I don't feel threatened. I am a junior faculty. Villanova has been, I would say, I don't know, maybe it's not everyone's experience, but at least at Villanova, I have not felt any particular threat. The students have been mobilized, it felt actually very hopeful, like to see, as you're saying, the young people, their politics are very clear, right? But then on the other hand, we're seeing Professor Shalhoub Kevorkian in Hebrew University, who was suspended for signing a couple letters talking about what's happening in Gaza as genocide, right? Nancy Fraser, US philosopher, was just disinvited from a visit visiting position at the German university for signing the philosopher's letter in support of Palestine, right? So these are very senior people who are suffering. So who am I to say, actually, we shouldn't feel threatened, right? But also I'm talking from a very specific positionality, which I do need to reveal here. I grew up in Tel Aviv, and I am still an Israeli citizen, even though I'm in the process of changing that. I have supported BDS for many, many years, and I've been active since October in organizing around Palestine here where I am. And so I think maybe I do not feel threatened because on one hand, no one here can accuse me of anti-Semitism, and no one there back in Palestine, Israel. I've seen Israeli academics who speak up, also being kind of threatened, and I'm not there, so not going there. I don't even visit, right? So I don't need to fear that either. So I do want to acknowledge that my positionality is very specific, and so the thing that I did want to talk about is about the classroom, right? What we can do with these students who are now, many of them for the first time, right? Like I see them become political, and I teach Native American stuff, and I'm teaching a course right now called Native America and the Question of Genocide. And every day in the classroom, I can't walk into a classroom on genocide and not talk about Palestine, and a classroom about indigeneity and not talk about Palestine. And so I have done that, and it feels so small and almost insignificant. Like but on the other hand, I see, we just had a week about Hawaii in this course, and students keep saying, "Oh, I didn't know any of that. I didn't know any of this colonial history. I've gone to Hawaii as a tourist and it was so beautiful and I didn't know anything. And now that I know, I don't know that I would go again." Or, like they are, it seems like that they seem to feel betrayed by their K-12 education when they discover that they don't know anything about the history or settler colonial history of their home country. I would say, I think everyone in this course is or almost everyone is American. And none of them is native as far as I know. So there's a sense that if we just give them some knowledge, they will act on it, or it can change them. And that, as Khaled says, yeah, the administration has been awful, but the young people can give us some hope. And so we do have a lot of power if we teach them, right? Like if we go into this classroom and we give them the opportunity to know more, so this is something that I would like us to talk about, like how we can do it in the classroom, how we can use these positions that we have, right? I don't think we should give them a history lesson, but we should encourage them to open the news, to know what's happening now, right? And then to want to read and learn to contextualize what they're hearing. So I would like to stop here and see, I'm more interested in conversation than in hearing myself. So.
All right, Jonathan's going to take up the next.
Thank you. So I feel a little bit like an interloper here because I'm not a policy study person. I'm not a political science person. I come from an Irish studies background, and I primarily teach Irish language here at Villanova. But of course, having come from Ireland and having grown up in Ireland, where there is a very large and I think broad-ranging support and affinity and solidarity with Palestine. It's been interesting for me to experience how that is dealt with here on campus or in a variety of campuses across the United States. And similar to how Dana feels about Villanova, as a new and junior scholar here, I certainly haven't felt under threat in this university. I haven't felt that there's been any attempt to control or to exert an influence on my engagement in the Palestine teach-ins here. But I was at a conference in Boston College right when the doxing was happening, and there were other Irish studies scholars there who were absolutely horrified, who were conducting research in Harvard and saw that and were absolutely horrified at what was happening there. So it's been very interesting to draw parallels and to think about what that means for academics who might not be working in a field that intersects with this area specifically, but have an interest in the area and want to speak out or want to speak up about that. In Ireland, you might be thinking, why does Ireland specifically have an interest in this? It's a Western European country. You might think that it aligns mostly with other Western European or Western countries, and that's not the case. It does. I mean, it tempers its public government kind of discourse on this to try and fit in with the European Union. However, it has been pushing the bounds of that recently from a political perspective, and also trying to exert what tiny little influence a very small country can have on the US connection. President Biden, of course, is from an Irish heritage. And this is something he was very warmly received in Ireland on his first trip. That has totally changed. He is now known as Genocide Joe there. So public discourse with regard to him has changed a lot. But from an Irish perspective, the interest in this, in terms of an affinity and a solidarity, has some striking historical parallels. In terms of having a neighbor, a neighbor that exerts colonial influence on your home country, and Britain, of course, being the United Kingdom being the neighbor there, sent in an auxiliary force into Ireland when Ireland was having its war of independence, the Black and Tans, who then were sent to Palestine as well. So there are some striking historical parallels. But recently, the Irish government have been speaking in terms of having an affinity, knowing what it means to be dispossessed of land, of your culture, of your language, and knowing hunger as well, because of the Great Famine that happened in Ireland in the 1800s. But another area for my own that overlaps with my research and my area of interest is in terms of discourse analysis. And of course, this intersects with what Khaled was saying earlier, where we have, from my perspective in this country at least, a very hegemonic discourse operating in terms of what it's permissible to say about this crisis. And we see that influence being exerted, I think, on academics in certain institutions and on students. And this is really interesting. There's a very interesting book on eco-linguistics by Aaron Stibbe that talks about the stories that we live by. And this book, it's talking about how the overarching stories, hegemonic stories, can condition the way we think. And so I feel like this is something that's happening here. And of course, as Khaled mentioned, this push to exert that kind of control happens when a hegemon, I think, feels threatened. And so I think, we can read some positives into that. But how does it condition how we can think? Well, Aaron Stibbe mentions I think it's the aphorism that's attributed to Jameson, although I think it's been attributed to a few other people too, that it's easier to think about the end of the world than it is to think about the end of capitalism. And so that's because we are so deeply ingrained and entrenched in capitalistic discourse that we can easier think about the entire planet, life on the planet ceasing to exist, then we can think about actually changing something, when really, an economic system should be maybe not easily changed, but something that's, it's human construction, it can be changed. Discourse on this can be changed too. Interestingly, what Khalid mentioned about the new McCarthyism, I've been struck by this too, and hearing what's been happening on other campuses feels chilling in terms of academic freedom, and feels Orwellian also in terms, again, this ties in with this idea of discourse and stories, that the words from 1984 on newspeak and doublethink, trying to control people, what is permissible to say and to think about certain topics, having moments of hate, all those kind of things, whipping people's fears up about aspects of this are interesting to me, but chilling in terms of controlling how people engage in this. I haven't felt as a junior scholar threatened or controlled in any way on this campus, but I can very well see how, given that, as Khalid mentioned, the threats to remove job offers, the public doxing of students and academics, how that may very well influence and silence people. But in a university context where we are surely meant to be free to discuss all topics, that's particularly frightening, I think, that this form of control is being pushed into the university sphere, because that has an impact beyond just discourse on this topic. So I think it's particularly important and encouraging to see that students have maintained a movement on this, have maintained pressure in terms of talking about it, because that's how we're going to change things. In Ireland, over 600 academics published a paper in the newspapers calling for an academic boycott of Israel. And again, this isn't something that's directed at individual Israeli academics or individual Israeli scholarship. It's meant to be about hitting a system that is allowing this to happen. And so the call is that no Irish university should engage with Israeli universities in terms of funding, in terms of scholarly collaboration. This is something that Ireland did pursue during apartheid in South Africa. There were boycotts in Ireland. Again, Ireland is a very small country, so what kind of impact can it have? However, the kind of push in terms of discourse can have an impact on other countries. So even though it might seem like contributing to discourse, raising your hand or your voice and saying, I don't agree with this, this is wrong, that is going against the sort of coercive attempts to control this discourse. And that small, I think, that can have a ripple effect, which will continue on to others and give them some courage to be able to speak up about this as well. So I would absolutely encourage any students to keep that up, keep up that pressure. It works in Ireland in terms of, so the public sphere is much more heavily invested in the BDS movement and in Palestinian solidarity than the Irish government is, but continued and sustained pressure from the public sphere in Ireland has pushed the government into making stronger stances both in the European Union and a stronger stance in relation to the American government, something that the Irish government has been very hesitant to criticize in the past because of massive economic relationships. And And that has been done by a centre-right government in Ireland. If the Sinn Féin left-wing coalition gets in the next government, it's likely that that sort of political pressure, both from Ireland in the European Union and on the US, will increase with regards to Palestinian support. So I think does that give away taking enough time?
No, it's wonderful. I'm sorry for the switching back and forth here. We're sharing a computer so that we can both be in the same room. Yes, let's stand here. So we should be able to, let's switch this to a gallery view. There we are. All right, thank you so much, all three of you. These have been really interesting perspectives. And one thing that I note that runs across all of these is the recognition of, Dana was talking about positionality and how the circumstances vary by institution, they vary within institutions, and we're seeing a lot of the same trends, but we're experiencing these differently. So, we know people who are more threatened than we ourselves are. We know people who are in stronger positions and maybe more able to engage in the kind of academic speech they normally would. Also, just what we're all seeing among our students, we're seeing a level of student engagement that, at least for me, and I've been doing this for a while, is higher than it's been at the past, at least at this institution, particularly. And I would add to this, I'm also seeing a shift in how students and how academics are framing this issue. And I teach Middle East politics, so sometimes classrooms have in the past been a bit fraught in terms of expectations of taking a side or endorsement or what have you, but the Israeli-Palestinian conflict hasn't been framed so overtly as a question of settler colonialism as I've seen in the last few years. So that framing to me seems to be picking up strength, really, and becoming more widespread, not just as an academic discussion, but as a commonly held framing among activists too. That to me seems like a basis for a new kind of engagement. Maybe that's driving part of what we're seeing among students. So those are my last few thoughts, thinking about what the three of you have raised. I wonder if we have some students participating here. We have some participants online. Would anyone like to ask a question or offer a comment as part of this discussion? If you are online, you can either do this by raising your hand or have one in the Q&A. Okay, I'm going to read this actually for the people in the room. No one has specifically mentioned very key issues: the extreme power of the Israeli Jewish lobby, AIPAC's extreme hold on Congress, Jewish billionaires intimidating universities and funding think tanks and anti-Palestine groups, tremendous Jewish influence, practically control over the corporate media and Hollywood, as well as politicians. No one has specifically condemned total US complicity for 2 generations now of Israeli apartheid and now genocide. It is the US which has provided the weapons, the money, the political manipulations that have made it possible for Israel to do what it's done for so long. And now it is genocide. So why have you all not been direct and to the point? Are you all intimidated? Or just kind of socialized to avoid the hot button critical issues that go to the heart of the situation? Who wants this one first? Oh, can it be me? I don't think anyone here is particularly intimidated. What we're getting is a very analytical take on some pretty wide-ranging issues. So, we can debate degrees to which there is Israeli influence over particular professions or centers of power, but we're here to talk about, what's going on for academics. And so everyone speaking here is speaking from the perspective of how are academics experiencing this in their professional lives? How do they see the interaction of politics with the essential work of academics? So that's a somewhat different framing, I think, than you might be looking for on this. If the others of you would like to join in.
I will say that the Irish government is not in favour of arms being sent to Israel. I mean, obviously, personally, I'm not. I think that should be avoided. That's a debate that's happening in the UK at the moment, and I believe the European Union is maybe changing position on that as well. But of course, the main player, as the commenter rightly identified, is the United States, and I don't have enough expertise or knowledge in this area to know about how something like that gets changed, but I imagine there's a whole lot more at work there in terms of a military-industrial complex. So I can't really comment to that specifically.
Khaled or Dana, would you like to take up any aspect of that? I think.
I mean, I'll just weigh in briefly. I mean, I agree. I don't think anybody's, I don't think anybody here is intimidated. I think, I mean, I did touch on the power of groups like the Anti-Defamation League. I mean, obviously there are many more groups that we could talk about, AIPAC and the American Jewish Committee, and, you know, Christians for, what is it? Christians United for Israel. I mean, there are lots of groups out there, both Jewish and non-Jewish, who have created a hugely asymmetrical political reality in Washington. The balance of power is, I think, it's not even close. I mean, there is no pro-Palestine lobby as such to speak of, as compared with, you know, however you define the pro-Israel lobby, kind of writ large, or just those groups that actually lobby Congress. I mean, it doesn't matter. It's hugely disproportionate. And that's just a part of the infrastructure. That's a part of the environment that we're operating in. I don't think anyone is denying it. It's there, but it's sort of about, okay, well, what now? And what does it mean? And where are we in this moment? I don't see the need to sort of dwell on the, you know, the fact that it's just part of the, it's part of the landscape, and it's part of the infrastructure and the environment that we're working in. And so now it's been duly acknowledged, but the conversation doesn't end there. I think it only starts there, actually.
Yeah, the first thing you said was about asymmetries of power, and asymmetries of how we frame this, and asymmetries of the perception of humanity. And so thinking about how those power dynamics are playing out in academia right now has really been our chief purpose here. I don't know if that was a sufficient response for the questioner, but let's see what else. Hala, do you?
No,
That one might-
the follow-up question is not worth a response. It's just silly.
Okay. Well, I also want to say we have several students participating here who have their own perspective on what campus life is like and what student activism is like. So I know we've been saying often from the faculty perspective that we're seeing a new uptick in activism by our students that is student organized and student led, which if you teach in the social sciences, or you're engaged in these issues, is really heartening for a whole range of reasons. But I'd like to hear more from the students about how they articulate that or what they perceive on campus. And I won't call on them, but it'd be nice.
Sure. I think that there's definitely more activism than seen around other issues. Like specifically, I was only here last year and this year, but last year there was very little activism, even like around the war in Ukraine, and like very little demonstrations made. But I think there's been like a pretty solid community of students that have been committed to like coming to events, publicizing information that just like hasn't really been available for any other political issue.
Yeah, so you think this is more issue driven than, say, your generation of students just happen to be more activist?
I think in other universities that might be the case, but here I think it's definitely a little more issue driven.
That's what it seems like, I think, to a lot of us as well. We have someone in the Q&A. Well, questions. Yeah. Well, questions that forward the discussion are always welcome. I don't know if we have additional perspectives. We have both graduate students and undergraduate students in the audience. Did you want to join in on this? Louder too, please.
Sure. Your commentary earlier about students entering in, I was in the Middle Eastern politics class that
This is the graduate students.
students entering with the framework of settler colonialism as the starting place changed. I remember my first debate amongst my friends coming about like Israel Palestine back in, I must have been 14 or something, and the debate was about a two-state solution versus a one-state solution. There was no mention of colonialism or indigeneity or anything like the sort. And I've in my experience and across the portion of the internet that I've seen and witnessing activism through that, it doesn't hold salience anymore for people my age. It seems it's no longer a question of, oh, they should have their own state. It should be two states. It's more a question of a more radical position, I would argue, of this is a form of settler colonialism that is going on nearly a century, and the work now is to deconstruct that form of colonialism rather than just finding peace, which I think has become, I think especially after like the 2020 riots in the United States and the activism around BLM, peace is such a loaded term for our generation that it is not necessarily just, it doesn't seem to be the goal for our generation of activists so much as like liberation for oppressed peoples seems to be like a driving force.
That takes us very much back to what you were saying in terms of the comparative thinking about solidarity in similar situations.
Yeah, and I think that's something, again, from an Irish perspective, that can happen across kind of time and geographies. So there's another one in terms of thinking in terms of solidarity of the Irish famine, where the Choctaw Nation made a donation to Irish people, having just been through the Trail of Tears themselves. And so that was something that was remembered and commemorated. And then Irish people made huge donations to the Navajo Nation during the COVID thing. So that can be something that works, solidarity with oppressed peoples. And I feel, of course, this is not all Irish people agree with this. You do have people, in Ireland who support Israel, but they're very much in the minority because the conditions of Irish history and of colonialism in Ireland mean that Irish people, I think, have an empathy for people who have undergone similar processes or who are experiencing it right now. And so I think understanding it, again, from an Irish perspective, it wasn't difficult to make that jump to understanding the Palestinian situation as one of settler colonialism, because Irish history has had a similar experience.
I don't know if either of you want to take up the thread from here. I'm thinking of Khalid's early point about, we see quite a lot of dominant narrative, and we see a lot of tactics that are about limiting what's permissible to say in the public sphere and punishing and a sort of new McCarthyism. And we see that at the same time, we see this rise of a new quantity and quality of activism among young people particularly. And so I'm convinced, that what you said about, how did you put it? About the narrative is evidence that they don't control, I actually wrote it down, but.
I can't remember if Khalid was it?
You were talking about.
That they've lost the narrative,
Yeah, so
essentially.
suppression.
So they have to resort to authoritarian means to impose a narrative beyond people, right? You can't control what people believe in their hearts, but you can control what people say and do.
Mm. Yeah, and so at the same time, we've seen some of these kinds of openings, that shift maybe in activism. There are a number of states that have passed anti-BDS legislation. So I know I gave a talk in Arkansas a few years ago that I could not give now, not because it was on anything to do with Israel and Palestine, but because the state of Arkansas now requires that anyone who speaks at the university sign a statement that they do not in any way support BDS or its ideals, which means you can't support things like divestment. This is a problematic position of having to state a political opinion in order to be able to engage in any kind of academic work.
Texas too. I worked in Texas for 7 years before I came here, and I think Governor Abbott has just signed in something more draconian sounding than that, even. Possibly no surprise for those of you who know Texas politics. But even before that, an event like this would have been unimaginable in the institution that I was working at. Absolutely.
And I think that it goes to how we've often had these things framed for us, in which, we have a lot of these events. We've had teach-ins where the first question has been, but don't you denounce Hamas? And so the framing has been, first express support for Israel, first express condemnation of certain groups, and then we can have an event, then we can have a discussion. But that framing already sets the terms, it sets the outcome and the tone.
That's also something, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just agreeing.
From the perspective of the conflict in Northern Ireland and the peace process that happened there, and where discourse on this is still contentious, They call that kind of thing whataboutery because it's something that doesn't allow a discussion to advance in any particular way, because you can go, you know, what about Hamas? What about when, so you just end up going back in history, and the history of the Northern Irish conflict is a long one. You can go back 400 years, and that's what you'll find, those redundant arguments go there. So it's not helpful in terms of advancing discussions, I think.
It can be sometimes an appeal to the emotions, though, you know, when people say, aren't you horrified by this thing that happened? Yes, I am. This is all very difficult subject matter for us, you know, even when we're witnessing it from a safe distance. So it's not always easy to avoid that kind of whataboutery, because we do feel a pull to engage in this and to feel things.
Can I jump in about this and maybe thinking together with the student who spoke before about the change in discourse, right, from a discourse about peace to a discourse about colonization. I can say that within Israeli academia and maybe even public, there has been a change within, I don't know, the past 10, 15 years, I guess growing up, I remember race was something that you wouldn't talk about at all because it was associated with Nazi Germany, right? Like you couldn't mention race. You could talk about ethnicity, you could talk about religion, you could talk about nationality, right? Like everything that's around it, kind of like you could dance around it in different ways, but you're right that the discourse was only about war and peace. That was the only legitimate discourse, and something shifted, I think. I want to say about 10 years ago, you could see that no one talks about, that there is a conversation about race around Palestine. And it came together with like, right, no one talks about peace anymore because no one believes in, I mean, I think what the student was saying is that for their generation, peace is not something that's even, right, an accurate description of anyone's desire. But I think there was something more troubling happening within Israeli discourse where peace was not something that you talked about anymore, but it opened the door to speaking about race. And I wonder if decolonization or settler colonial discourse can ever enter academic. Well, it's probably entered the academic discourse, right? But not necessarily the public discourse. But I think that if the discourse of settler colonialism and decolonization gains more ground, then you can talk about how settlers too suffer from, like, right, like the system hurts everyone. So you're not safe of it, even if you're the settler, and it seems like you're only benefiting from it, right? Like, so I don't know, it seems almost utopian to think that this kind of discourse is possible right now within among these what used to call itself, I don't know, the Israeli left, right? I don't know if it exists anymore, but I wonder if this is a way to start. When someone asks you, but aren't you denouncing Hamas? Like, yeah.
Can I just jump in on maybe a tangential point on the settler colonialism? I mean, I think the settler colonial framing is probably relevant in the academic environment, and I know that's the focus of what we're talking about. But I'm not sure that it will really resonate with a kind of general audience, you know, the general public. It's, you know, it's kind of jargon, right? It's, what does it mean? And I think it's also invisible in the sense that Americans, the words settler and colonial are not bad words, right? Even when you put them together, it's like, well, we have colonial architecture, and we go to colonial Williamsburg here in Virginia, and it's lovely. And you know, we talk about the settlements and settlers, and they're good. They were good, right? They were pioneers. And so it's, it sort of reminds me of this anecdote. I don't know where it comes from, about, a frog on the banks of a lake, and he sees a fish, and he asks the fish, "How's the water?" And the fish says, "What's water?" And it's kind of, that's what we're talking about when we're talking about settler colonialism. We're immersed in, we're in this environment where we sprung forth from it, and so we can't see it because we're surrounded by it. And so it may not be the most effective framing for the general public, but I think people do understand power. People understand power imbalance, and people understand injustice that results from that, abuse of that power. And that's what the Me Too movement was, and that's what Black Lives Matter was about. And I think that's what resonates with people right now. I think it was Alicia Garza, the African-American civil rights activist, who said, what's happening now in Gaza is the international George Floyd moment. Because people see the asymmetry, that people see the injustice, and it's visceral. And you don't even need to use terms like settler colonial. Now, maybe, in an academic environment and for analytical purposes, sure, that's a great framing. But anyway, just a gratuitous point that just popped in my head.
Yeah, no, I'm compelled, but by what you're saying, absolutely. I guess I was thinking again within the context of how we think about Israel, or because the term settler has been used only to refer to illegal settlements in the West Bank and the people who live there, expanding that, right? Like, I don't know, I wonder how does one start to realize that if you sit at a coffee shop in Tel Aviv and you have a Palestinian friend, you're also a settler, right? Like, I don't know, maybe you're right. Maybe discourse on power is enough and we don't need these kind of like nuances, but just that's where I'm thinking from.
Does seem to be a basis for kind of cross-community solidarity. I mean, you've made the case about settler colonialism resonating in Irish discourse, and I know with Native communities, this is definitely a point of very direct and explicit comparison. But you're right, in mainstream, political discourse in the United States, mainstream middle-class discourse, it's going to sound like academic jargon. Yeah, I do see that. Analytically, I love it, but I see your point too. I'm going to check back in on our Q&A. Nope, still going. We're gonna omit those for the moment. Anyone in the room, any other students like to raise issues for us? Because there are so many aspects of this we can take on.
Yeah, several of you all mentioned like feeling empowered to hold political stances on the issue. Does that question change based on how radical of a position that you're expressing? Because I could see a world where universities were much more willing to engage in the sort of both sides-ness type of rhetoric that emerged after October 7th, but being much less empowering and protective of their academics if they were posing more radical frameworks around like settler colonialism and what liberation efforts look like in the contemporary political landscape.
Well, one thing I'll point out is that even within an institution, there's variation. And so Dana and Jonathan are in the same department, and they're in an environment where I think these are ordinary conversations to have. They're appropriate academically. That's not true across all departments. And so not all faculty are in a position to, test out radical propositions or do what you're suggesting there. So there is this sort of self-imposed element of caution that doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from a real, assessment of what's permissible and what's not. But it also varies across institutions. And so I know others will have really different experiences here. And there's the principled question of, can you have can you have scholarship that doesn't effectively have any position, that is fully neutral? I'm not sure that's actually possible, but it's something that's often advocated.
I'm not even sure that, you know, what we've been discussing here is particularly radical, but I take your point. Having been in Texas and not having felt empowered or emboldened to speak about anything political at all, really. When I spoke at the first Palestine teaching that I was involved in here last semester, the thoughts did go through my mind. I mean, is this going to have an impact on my position here, on how I'm viewed within the university? I've just started. I remembered how things were in Texas. I didn't know how things were in this university just yet. But I just made the decision that if this was going to be something that was viewed negatively and that would have a negative impact on my position here, then so be it. It wasn't going to be the place for me. So that was my own personal response to it. But yeah, I mean, in terms of objectivity, academic objectivity, I think I mean, you know, you could go into all sorts of sociological arguments about that and Bourdieu and your, you know, academics' position and how they're embedded in their subject matter. Yeah, we strive for objectivity, but is it really truly ever possible? I don't think so, probably. Sure that answers your question, but.
What do you think?
Catherine, is it fair to ask the students in the room? I can't see you all, but I'm glad that you're there. What we can do to support and encourage them in doing what they are doing. I mean, we may not be feeling threatened at all, Jonathan and I, but also we have no power, and the students who pay a lot of money to be in the institution may have more power than us. And so I think of ourselves as supporter rather than right, like people who lead anything there. So yeah, I don't know if anyone there wants to share or ask us anything of us.
Is there a perception among students that this has anything to do with faculty, or is student activism its own thing?
I mean, I think that a lot of the students involved, especially like with SJP and like planning all the teach-ins and all of that, I think the faculty support has been like really noticed and appreciated, especially like the consistency, especially. And I think that it's like the group of students that's been like involved has kind of been like remained the same and like seemingly grown a bit, but there's been like conversation about how this is kind of like the only space where we have these conversations. Like some poli-sci classes, like AIS classes, it's obviously like a little easier to work into the curriculum, but I think that like outside of that, like socially and even like academically and other disciplines, it's not really like a prominent topic of conversation. So it's been nice to have like a designated space.
Makes sense.
I guess for my alma mater has been a source of embarrassment recently as well. Vanderbilt University recently arrested journalists on campus and has been placing students protesting and performing sit-ins to try and force the university's hand in divestment. They've been placing them on academic probation, and with that, for a lot of Vanderbilt students, where the majority of the population is on financial aid, which includes like meal services and housing, it has functionally made a lot of very poor people that go to Vanderbilt homeless and without access to food. So I guess the role of academics and professors is, I think, one of protecting students who are willing to take these brave stances and risk not just their attendance at an institution, but oftentimes risk their access to safe housing and safe food and consistent housing, consistent access to meals. So I think academics hold a lot of power because we pay the bills, but they can also kick us out if they want to. And with that comes a lot of consequences that students in their, teenagers and early 20s aren't necessarily capable of handling, in the same way that academics have a lot of power in, you all run the school as much as they might not want to think so.
It's an interesting idea that the faculty run the school. I'm not sure it's true, but I see what you mean. And the Vanderbilt case is a really, really important one to point to as well. It's so clear cut, that case.
haven't heard about that one. Yeah, that's shocking. I didn't realize that had happened, and it seems, I mean, from a European perspective, those kind of student engagement in politics and in manifestations, strikes, it seems normal and a lot more widespread, and exerting control over that here seems very scary. I mean, I did an Erasmus in France, and the student engagement in resisting government policies or anything there is orders of magnitude more extreme than what you see here. So in my entire semester, the students shut down the university, blockaded the entrances and exits to any of the rooms. They had weekly council meetings where they decided whether the university would open again or not again. And the faculty eventually went out on strike with the students. So the resistance to anything, it happens almost every year in France, is just a lot more radical than what we see here. And that kind of draconian measures taken against a sit-in is, I just can't fathom it. It's, yeah, it's crazy.
That's an interesting point to raise too, this reminder that when we think about what creates free academic spaces, and we're thinking about solidarity, student faculty solidarity within an institution, might not be on our radar, but it can be very, very effective. How much time do we have left? We only have a few minutes left, so other comments that any of you would like to make on any of the issues that.
There's another one on the.
Well, there is, but we'll see if. Khaled or Dana, would you like to add anything else to what we're kicking around here? Jonathan, further thoughts?
No, I mean, I'm just snowballing on the French thing again. I mean, that year of revolutions in Europe in 1968, where again, academics were involved along with students in terms of trying to make change and make a difference, is an interesting idea. Maybe we can all re-examine that point in history, maybe. Just a thought based on, I still think this is a lot stronger in France, where it's almost a tradition that students will strike and resist. When I was there, it was against educational reform, and they said that it was that the French Education Ministry was trying to push a US style third level education system on students there, and they called it the McDonaldization of the education system, and they were absolutely against this, and they went out. I mean, they had marches every week in the town. They blockaded the university. We were allowed to take our French classes, but we had to pass through a student council in order to get into the building to take the French classes, but those were the only classes that were permitted to take place by the student strike council. So, you know, trying to plant ideas and everything. But
No, but so John, if I can just say a couple of sentences, it's a good point that where there is a tradition of student resistance, you see it more easily continued, right? And we can think about our students now as creating a tradition, but actually there is a tradition. I mean, I think there has been many years that Villanova students have been quiet, but we can go back to the 60s and 70s. There have been activism on campus, right? Black students occupying the president's office and things like that, that we can maybe, you know, I was saying before, if only students read the news, if they know what's happening, they will do something about it, right? I'm pretty sure. But also, if they know this history of student activism on campus, that can also empower them. And so maybe part of our job is also to dig into the archives and show them this tradition here.
I think that would be good for us as well. We don't necessarily know the history of our own institutions as well as we could.
Great idea.
All right, we'll wrap it up here. I want to thank Khaled and Dana and Jonathan very much for your time and your expertise. You've been very generous, and this has been a wonderful conversation. So thank you for joining us. Thank you to the attendees.
Thank you.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone. We'll end the webinar now.